The Bible. It's a collection of ancient texts, prophecies, poetry, history, and letters. It holds stories of kings, shepherds, wars, and miracles. But for many, the Bible remains an unopened mystery. Here at The Bible Explained, we're not just reading verses, we're exploring the cultural bedrock and the dramatic narrative woven through its 66 books. Hit that subscribe button and let the journey begin.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take complex stories you thought you knew, hand you the source material, and give you the fast track to being profoundly well-informed.
Today, we're ripping through the layers of tinsel and tradition built up over centuries.
We really are, because of the historical and theological narrative of the Nativity story is, well, it's far more complex and, frankly, far more volatile than the peaceful picture we usually paint.
And that's the mission today. When you look at the entire stack of sources, the raw biblical accounts, archaeological finds, early church commentary, the historical records, it becomes instantly clear that the popular Christmas narrative is a tapestry.
Woven from very different threads.
Exactly, independent threads. So we're here to act as your guides, helping you differentiate what is explicitly stated in the core biblical accounts of Matthew and Luke, what was added later by tradition, and what historical inferences we can actually support.
The goal is clarity, depth, and those aha moments that make you truly understand the source material. We have three major analytical puzzles we're going to solve in this deep dive.
Right.
First, we need to completely deconstruct the famous wise men or magi. If they weren't three kings on camels arriving at a stable, who are these political figures and why does their arrival matter so much?
It matters immensely. Second, we have to face the fundamental problem. We have two canonical, inspired stories of the birth, Matthew and Luke, and they fundamentally disagree on the setting, the timeline, and the supporting cast. We need to explore why they're so different.
And finally, we tackled the massive historical controversy behind the date of December 25th itself.
Yes, the big one. We'll explore the competing theories. Was it chosen through a rigorous internal theological calculation, or was it a brilliant, deliberate move of cultural assimilation designed to overlay powerful Roman pagan festivals?
This journey is about connecting the dots between ancient prophecy, imperial history, and theological necessity.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the most exotic and historically misunderstood figures in the entire story, the Magi. When you look directly at the source material, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, and we have to stress this for you, the listener, they appear solely in the Gospel of Matthew. The description we get is astonishingly sparse.
It is remarkably thin, and yet later tradition has filled every single gap. Matthew simply states they came from the east, or in the Greek, apo anatolun,
Which is pretty vague.
very vague. And they arrive in Jerusalem seeking the one who has been born King of the Jews. They follow a star, they worship, they give gifts, and they leave. Critically, Scripture does not provide their names, their country of origin, their exact number, or even their social status.
They're entirely anonymous travelers. Highly specialized, yes, but anonymous.
That's the key.
Which makes the universal image of three specific named and usually royal figures, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, so compellingly persistent. Where exactly did we conjure up those missing details?
Well, they are entirely the product of later tradition and theological inference. The original term magi was often translated in early biblical versions as astrologers or stargazers.
Sometimes even sorcerers, right? Which has a very different feel.
A very different feel, and it's actually closer to the root meaning. However, by the 3rd century CE, the church began increasingly identifying them as kings.
Why? Why the upgrade?
Well, it wasn't arbitrary. It was done consciously to align the narrative with powerful Old Testament messianic prophecies, like those in Psalm 72, which stated that the Messiah would be worshipped by kings of Tarshish and of the Isles. Theologically, it just made sense to upgrade their status. It had to happen.
And the common number, 3, is really just an inventory count.
Exactly. It's that simple. The 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, suggested a party of 3 gift givers. But even that isn't universal.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, if you explore Syriac Christian tradition, for example, the belief often holds that there were 12 magi.
12.
12. So the popular tradition of 3 is simply an assumption based on the manifest of presence, not an explicit statement of headcount.
So we have 3 nameless astrologers from the East who, within about 300 years, become 3 named kings. When do the specific recognizable names first pop up?
The names you hear every Christmas, Melchior, Caspar, and Balthazar, are definitely non-biblical. We first see them recorded in an 8th century religious document called the Excerpta Latina Barbari.
Right.
And this text was a Latin translation of an earlier Greek chronicle, likely composed in Alexandria around the 6th century. So you have a gap of, roughly 6 centuries after the event before these figures acquire their now famous identities.
That time frame just shows you how robustly tradition can evolve when the scriptural facts are so sparse.
It really does.
And within that historical tradition, there's an extraordinary, highly specific piece of geographical detective work regarding the origin of one name, Caspar.
This is one of those deep dives that just makes the sources come alive. There's a really compelling theory linking the name Caspar to the historical Indo-Parthian king Gondophares I.
Gondophares.
Yeah, he reigned in the first half of the 1st century CE. His name in the historical record, Gudapharasa, bears a striking phonetic resemblance to Gaspar, which then became Caspar.
And the geography here is crucial.
The geography is everything. Gondophares I ruled a massive empire that stretched across what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. This placement fits perfectly with Matthew's designation that the Magi came from the east,
So it establishes them firmly within the great Parthian Empire.
which was Rome's primary aggressive geopolitical rival. This isn't just some vague east. This is enemy territory.
So let's pivot from names to their actual power structure. If they weren't literally kings, what was their social and political status? Because the sources paint them as far more than just scholars.
Oh, much more. They were an ancient, exceptionally powerful, and highly organized pagan priesthood. They were possibly connected to the Chaldeans.
The intellectual and religious class from the old Babylonian Empire.
That's them. They specialized in astrology, astronomy, and dream interpretation. They were the ultimate keepers of occult knowledge. In the East, this was the highest level of learning and political influence one could attain.
This is where it gets really interesting for me because they weren't just stargazers for the court. They were effectively political power brokers who controlled the destiny of the Persian Empire.
Absolutely. Their influence in the Persian and later the Parthian Empire was total. They had garnered such tremendous and enduring social and religious influence that historians confirm they were the ultimate kingmakers.
What does that mean, kingmakers?
It means you simply could not ascend to the Persian throne without their sanction. They required that the prospective king first master their disciplines, astronomy, philosophy, religion, and then, crucially, he had to be formally approved and crowned by them.
So they weren't just advisors.
Not at all. They were a mystical consortium who legitimized and controlled the flow of power.
Which means their journey to Jerusalem, crossing into Roman territory and asking Herod for the whereabouts of the king of the Jews was, that's a profoundly political act.
It was an act of international political sabotage, disguised as a religious pilgrimage. It was the ultimate statement of foreign recognition, specifically from Rome's most enduring enemy, the Parthians.
They were offering homage, allegiance, and tribute to a newborn rival king right under Herod's nose, deep inside Roman client territory.
This wasn't a sweet visit. This was a geopolitical earthquake, and Herod recognized it immediately.
Now, they were guided by the famous Star of Bethlehem. This star itself generates so much debate because the text describes its behavior in ways that try easy astronomical explanation.
And that's the crux of the debate, isn't it? Many commentators argue that the star's description in Matthew's Gospel suggests it was not a typical natural cosmological phenomenon, not a supernova or a comet.
It's not just that it was bright. The text implies it physically moved and directed them.
Yes. It was seen moving east to west when they traveled to Jerusalem. Then it shifted direction to move north to south, leading them directly from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And then, and this is the amazing part, it stopped, precisely over the specific house where the child was located.
A star that stops and hovers over the single structure is not a star behaving naturally.
Precisely. This has led many theologians to view it as the Shekinah, the sovereign glory of God manifesting in a way specifically designed to communicate with these Chaldean students of the stars.
It's God meeting them on their own terms.
Exactly, using their language, celestial navigation, to guide them to Christ.
But to maintain our balance, we have to acknowledge the strong counterpoint, the natural scientific theories for the Star of Bethlehem.
Of course. And they are definitely well established. These theories attempt to explain the phenomenon using known astronomical events from around that time. This includes the famous triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn,
which astronomer Johannes Kepler calculated happened in 7 BCE.
That's the one. Other possibilities are supernovas, the sudden, bright explosions of massive stars or comets, which appear to move across the sky.
But the challenge for all these natural theories,
The enduring challenge is whether a regular conjunction or comet could truly achieve the specific directional guidance, the stopping over a single house, as described in Matthew. But the key insight, whether you take the natural or supernatural view, is that it worked. It successfully drew this highly influential foreign delegation to Christ.
the presence of the Magi, these political kingmakers, it sets up our next major puzzle perfectly.
It really does.
If the Magi's visit was such a seismic political event, a threat that provoked Herod's massacre of the innocents, why does Luke, who often focuses on historical and political context, ignore them entirely? That's the real question that leads us to the M&L sources.
That framing is absolutely essential. We treat the Nativity as a single, unified Christmas story. But when you line up the gospel accounts of Matthew and Luke, they agree on a few core facts.
Bethlehem birth, Mary and Joseph, Davidic lineage, divine intervention. The basics.
The absolute basics, yeah. But they diverge significantly on almost every narrative detail. The timeline, the supporting cast, and, crucially, the purpose of the events.
And understanding why they diverge is critical to appreciating their theological purpose. They are built on fundamentally independent sources.
They are. The two accounts utilize entirely independent source material, which scholars traditionally label the M source for Matthew and the L source for Luke. They are so divergent that, everyone agrees they cannot be harmonized into a single coherent chronological narrative.
Not without some serious intellectual acrobatics.
Substantial forcing, yes. They simply present two different yet inspired perspectives.
So let's detail those distinct theological aims and the audiences they were written for. How did Matthew approach the Nativity?
Matthew wrote explicitly for a Jewish audience. His entire purpose was to anchor Jesus' identity in Jewish prophecy and heritage, to demonstrate that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah who perfectly fulfilled the Old Testament law.
So his narrative is just packed with prophetic quotes.
Packed. He's constantly pointing directly back to the traditions of Israel, and consequently, Joseph dominates Matthew's account. It is Joseph who receives the annunciation and guidance through dreams, validating Jesus' legal and generational lineage and ensuring the family's survival.
The tone is very royal, but also dangerous. Jesus as a new Moses, born under threat.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with Luke. What was his theological project?
It's completely different.
Luke's aim was entirely universal. He wrote likely for a Gentile, a non-Jewish audience, and focuses on portraying Jesus' significance to all of humanity. He's reaching beyond the Jewish confines.
And he emphasizes humility and social inclusion.
Totally. His account features the lowest members of society, the humble shepherds receiving the grand announcement. That's a sharp contrast with Matthew's focus on foreign dignitaries and kings.
And Mary dominates his account.
Yes, she receives the Annunciation directly, and his narrative includes the Magnificent Magnificat, which is Mary's famous hymn of praise, one of the most ancient pieces of Christian worship. Luke presents Jesus as a humble servant, often using language that echoes the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Okay, let's break down the contrasting itineraries, because they really do paint two non-overlapping early childhood stories. Let's start with Matthew's timeline.
Matthew's itinerary starts with the family in Bethlehem. He seems to imply Joseph was already living there, or at least had a permanent dwelling there.
Not just visiting for a census.
Right. Then they flee to Egypt to escape Herod, and only then do they settle in Nazareth. The movements are driven by external threats and prophetic guidance in dreams.
And Matthew's is the only gospel that includes the Annunciation to Joseph, the journey of the Magi, Herod's plot, the gruesome massacre of the innocents, and the flight into Egypt.
It's a story focused on geopolitical confrontation and the fulfillment of very specific prophetic warnings.
And now, Luke's itinerary, which is, as you said, completely different.
Completely. Luke's story, the L source, begins with the family already established in Nazareth. They journey to Bethlehem only for the purpose of the census, a temporary bureaucratic necessity.
And after the birth.
They immediately return to Nazareth, stopping for the ritual presentation in the temple on the 40th day. Luke uniquely includes the Annunciation to Mary, the prehistory of John the Baptist's birth, the census of Quirinius, the adoration of the shepherds, and that presentation in the temple.
So Luke focuses on the peaceful, routine aspects of Jesus' infancy. He's a humble figure, growing up in obscurity.
Waiting for his public debut, it's a very different feel.
The scholarly perspective here really forces us to realize that They weren't trying to write a journalistic report.
Precisely. They were strategic in what they selected. If Matthew needed to focus on the prophecy that required the family to come out of Egypt, referencing Hosea, he couldn't really include the shepherds arriving first.
And if Luke wanted to focus on the humble announcement to shepherds
Yeah.
and the subsequent temple presentation,
He couldn't easily explain why the family would then need to flee to Egypt right after that. It wouldn't fit. The Gospels were written as theological documents to illustrate the character and significance of Jesus for their specific audiences.
their purpose was theological truth, and historicity was sort of secondary to conveying that truth.
That's a good way to put it.
This tension between the two accounts becomes most acute when we introduce Herod the Great. His character and his actions in Matthew's account introduce immediate chronological consequences that directly challenge our traditional timeline.
The sources are crystal clear on this. The phrase, King of the Jews, was like dynamite in Herod's court.
He was already known for extreme paranoia. He'd murdered his own sons, his wife.
His mother-in-law, anyone he saw as a potential rival. So when the Magi arrived, the sources say he was immediately troubled, deeply disturbed, or frightened. He didn't just feel threatened. The political status quo was instantly fractured.
He saw this newborn as an existential threat.
To his whole puppet kingdom, yes. One source mentions his throne room had become his echo chamber. This sense of isolation and absolute power just fed his instantaneous strategic deception.
He cloaked his sinister intentions in piety.
Absolutely. He calls the Magi back and directs them to Bethlehem with that absolute lie. Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring word back to me that I may come and worship him also.
His goal was to use these good men, these foreign dignitaries, as his unwitting bounty hunters.
That's exactly it.
But the Magi, warned in a dream, failed to return. This led directly to the infamous and grotesque massacre of the innocents. And this event, as horrific as it is the crucial key to the timing of the birth in Matthew's Gospel.
It provides the vital chronological detail. Herod flew into an immediate murderous rage and decreed the killing of all male children 2 years old and under in Bethlehem and the surrounding districts.
And the biblical text gives the rationale for that specific age bracket.
It does. He chose it according to the time which he had determined from the wise men regarding when the star first appeared.
So to recap this for you, the listener, the source material forces us to decouple the Magi from the stable scene entirely. If Herod determined the threat timeline based on their initial sighting of the star, then the Magi had to have arrived months, possibly up to 2 years after the actual birth.
That is the logical consequence of the text. When the Magi arrived, the Holy Family was almost certainly living in a permanent house. Matthew uses the Greek word oikia, not the temporary shelter or guest room where the birth occurred.
This significant span of time suggests the family had settled down, allowing the Magi time for their long journey from Parthia and for the event to fade from immediate memory in Bethlehem.
Right. If the Magi had arrived immediately, Herod would have decreed the killing of newborns, of infants, not children to 2 years old.
This forces us to confront a potential conflict. Are we forced to choose between the two gospel timelines if we include Herod's decree? Because the shepherds in Luke arrive immediately, but the Magi in Matthew arrive much later.
That challenge remains. Scholars attempting to harmonize the accounts often suggest that maybe the Magi arrived just before the family's planned presentation in the temple, which is 40 days after the birth, forcing them to flee to Egypt and thereby interrupting Luke's sequence.
But Herod's 2-year decree really stretches credulity for such a short time frame.
It really does. The more, I think, honest scholarly approach is to accept the two narratives as independent theological statements. Matthew required a threat and a flight into Egypt to fulfill prophecy. Luke required an immediate return to Nazareth and the temple rituals to establish normalcy.
Okay, now we have to address the largest and most persistent historical challenge to the Nativity timeline, which comes entirely from Luke, the census of Quirinius.
The problem is profound because it links the sacred narrative directly to secular Roman bureaucracy, and the dates, well, they appear to clash.
So Luke attributes the journey to Bethlehem to a census decreed by Caesar Augustus, which he specifies was the first census while Quirinius was ruling Syria.
Right. And as we noted, Herod the Great, during whose reign Jesus was born, died around 4 BCE.
But the documented dates for Quirinius as the Roman governor of Syria are AD 6-7. That's over a decade later.
Exactly. If the census happened under Quirinius in 86, the birth couldn't have happened under Herod in 4 BCE. It's a direct conflict.
This has led critics to argue Luke simply made a historical error. But there is a robust defense based on historical context and specific archaeological finds.
We have to start with Roman policy. Augustus was an administrative genius, and he was known to introduce general censuses called dogma in the Greek, which Luke uses for tax assessment across the empire.
So the idea of a census itself isn't the problem.
Not at all. We have documented evidence of similar censuses taking place in nearby Roman provinces like Egypt and Lebanon during this general era. So the idea of a census happening around Judea is entirely substantiated by Roman policy.
But the timing and the person Quirinius remain the sticking point. How do scholars try to fit Quirinius into that earlier time frame before Herod died?
Well, the most famous attempt at reconciliation hinges on a broken inscription known as the Lapis Tiburtinus.
The Tiber stone.
Yes, this tombstone, discovered in Italy, records the distinguished career of an Augustan army officer. Crucially, it mentions that this officer served as praetor of Syria twice.
But the name is missing.
The name is missing, unfortunately. However, scholars like Sir William Ramsay conjecture that this officer was Quirinius, suggesting he had an earlier term of office, perhaps a military command, prior to his formal governorship in 86-7.
So if he served twice, the earlier term could potentially fit the first census mentioned by Luke.
And that would allow the birth to occur under Herod. It's a strong conjecture, but it does rely on an educated guess about a missing name.
Is there an alternative historical defense?
Yes, there's an intriguing argument preserved by the early church father Tertullian in his work against Marcion. Tertullian suggested that the census in Judea was actually conducted by Sentius Saturninus, who governed Syria from 9 to 6 BC.
Which perfectly fits the Herod timeline.
Perfectly. Tertullian argued that Quirinius's rulership was merely used by Luke as a reference point for dating, perhaps because Quirinius was in charge of a concurrent military action or had some kind of co-administrative role.
So Saturnius handled the civil administration, the census, while Quirinius handled military affairs.
That's one possibility. Or maybe Quirinius's name was just more recognizable to Luke's audience for dating the period.
So we have potential evidence of a double term or co-administration, or simply using a recognizable name for dating reference. All of these require a degree of scholarly interpretation to validate Luke's chronology.
Exactly. And then you have the very practical question of the travel requirement. Secular history doesn't record Augustus commanding a mass migration back to cities of origin for a purely administrative tax census.
Right. Critics correctly point out that for a wealth-based tax census, it would be wildly inefficient to force people to leave their current property and livelihoods, especially for long distances.
They do. Conversely, those defending Luke argue that Augustus was known to be keenly sensitive to the nationalistic feelings of his provinces. Requiring people to return to their ancestral hometowns, which was the source of the Davidic line tradition for Joseph, might have been a concession to Jewish custom.
Easing the burden of Roman taxation.
Possibly. But other sources argue that requiring such mass travel, particularly during winter when Judean roads were often impassable and the country could freeze, would have been profoundly incompetent for a Roman administrator.
It puts a very human, frustrating layer on what Luke describes.
It does. The debate over the census is incredibly complex, with historians drawing on external texts and political custom to either validate or question Luke's precise dating.
Let's move from the timeline of the birth to the celebration of the birth, specifically December 25th. The sources are upfront. The current date is, quote, improbable but not impossible.
That's a good way to phrase it. The early church simply did not celebrate Jesus' birth, so the exact date was not historically preserved. The date we use wasn't officially proclaimed until AD 440, though the first recorded mention we have is in the year 354.
That gap of 3 to 4 centuries is why the debate over the date is so fierce.
It is. There are two major competing theories regarding how the church ultimately settled on December 25th, and they provide profound insights into early Christian intellectual life and cultural strategy.
And theory A is the one everybody knows. Pagan assimilation, linking the date to the winter solstice.
This theory, which is the most popular one, posits that the date was chosen deliberately at the time of the winter solstice, the shortest and darkest days of the year, to align with powerful existing Roman pagan celebrations.
The strategic goal was to co-opt the existing holiday structure.
Exactly. Encourage the spread of Christianity by making the new holiday look superficially familiar to existing traditions.
And the major influences here are the Roman festivals, specifically Saturnalia, and the Feast of Sol Invictus. Tell us how those traditions crossed over into Christmas celebrations.
Well, the date aligned with the culmination of the Roman celebration of Saturnalia, a major festival that traditionally started around December 17th, and Saturnalia was pure revelry.
A time of feasting, relaxed social codes, gift exchange.
Total inversion of social roles. Masters and slaves would often swap clothes or eat together. They would exchange small, symbolic gifts, often candles or caged birds. This custom fed directly into later Christian traditions.
Things like giving small presents and the general atmosphere of revelry we see in medieval Twelfth Night revels.
Yes, with their temporary lords of misrule, it's a direct line.
And then there is the sun god connection.
Right. December 25th was firmly established by the Roman Emperor Aurelian in 274 CE as the feast of the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun.
So the assimilation argument suggests early Christians adapted this date by symbolically replacing the pagan worship of the literal sun with the worship of Christ, the true Son of Righteousness.
It was a brilliant cultural coup. Keep the date, change the focus.
However, there's a direct, strong counter-argument from tradition that calls the Nativity a theological polemic against paganism, arguing that the date was chosen for its spiritual symmetry, not its cultural convenience.
And that's theory B, the calculation theory. Proponents of this view argue that the date was chosen precisely because Christ, the light of the world, was born when the astronomical darkness was greatest.
The theological focus was on the paradox, the Son of Righteousness rising when the natural sun was weakest.
Exactly. One ancient hymn, the Troparion, emphasizes this. Your nativity, O Christ our God, has shown to the world the light of wisdom. The idea that the nativity was chosen to destroy paganism, not accommodate it, is a powerful ancient perspective.
So let's elaborate on theory B, the calculation based on Annunciation and death. This less famous theory suggests the date was set by internal theological symmetry, not external pagan holidays.
This is the most ancient view, dating back further than the official celebration. The earliest source mentioning December 25th, Hippolytus of Rome in the early 3rd century, calculated it using a very specific assumption.
And what was that?
That Jesus' conception, the Annunciation, took place on the spring equinox, March 25th. You add 9 months, and that naturally leads to a birth date of December 25th.
What's the rationale behind linking conception and death to the same day, March 25th?
It stems from an ancient Jewish belief, also cited by Tertullian, that the perfect lifespan meant a prophet would die on the same day of the year they were conceived.
So since Jesus' death and resurrection were the core theological events, the crucifixion date was established first.
Correct. Traditionally, around March 25th or April 6th. So if the crucifixion and conception were on March 25th, the resulting birth date had to be exactly 9 months later, December 25th. It emphasizes spiritual symmetry over historical observation.
Before we move on, we should quickly clarify the calendar confusion that causes modern differences, like the Orthodox Christmas being January 7th.
This is purely a calendar issue. The Western Church adopted December 25th for the Nativity, while the Eastern Church initially focused more on January 6th, the Epiphany,
which commemorated both the baptism and the Magi's visit.
Right. Over time, the Council of Tours in 567 CE declared the 12 days between December 25th and January 6th a unified festival cycle. The remaining difference, that January 7th date, simply reflects the difference between the modern Gregorian calendar and the older Julian calendar. January 7th is December 25th on the Julian calendar.
Finally, we must return to the powerful counter-arguments based on agriculture and climate, which suggests December is historically unlikely for the actual event.
This is a very practical pastoral critique. Luke mentions shepherds having their flocks in open fields at night.
Right.
If we consult Israeli agricultural calendar analysis, sheep would typically only be grazing in the fields from about the 5th through the 7th Hebrew month, which is approximately August through October.
The main rains and cold weather begin in December and January.
At which point, sheep would have been corralled close to town or sheltered, not roaming in open fields.
So based purely on weather and farming practice, a December birth is hard to justify.
It suggests a much warmer fall birth. Many scholars have proposed alternative dates, often correlating the birth with a major Jewish festival like the Feast of Tabernacles in September or October.
So the key takeaway here is that December 25th is rooted in sophisticated theological calculation and subsequent cultural assimilation, not in a preserved historical record of the precise moment itself.
That's it, exactly.
Speaking of traditions versus source material, let's quickly clarify the actual birth location. The traditional image we all know is a lonely stable behind a commercial inn. Mary and Joseph shut out into the cold.
But the original Greek suggests something very different about the family's environment.
It absolutely does. The language used in Luke 2.7 is critical. It states Mary laid the baby in a manger because there was no place for them in the guest room.
The word used here is katalima, which literally means a place to stay, or guest room. Crucially, this is not the standard Greek word for a commercial inn, which would be Pandotian.
And katalima is the same word used for the upper room where Jesus later held the Last Supper. This shifts the entire setting from a commercial stable to an overcrowded family house.
That is the profound implication. The setting was likely a private house, probably belonging to Joseph's relatives, who had already arrived in Bethlehem for the census.
Tell us about the layout of these homes.
First-century peasant homes in Judea often had three parts: a storeroom, a main family living area on the lower floor, and a katalima or guest room on the second floor or to the side. The animals were frequently brought into that main living area during cold nights for warmth and security.
And the mangers were built right into the floor or walls of that space.
That's right. So Mary and Joseph weren't shut out by a cruel innkeeper, but likely had a lonely berth in the main family room because the dedicated guest room was already full of other relatives. The manger was simply the feeding trough for the animals housed indoors.
It implies a potentially lonely birth, but one that occurred within the communal, if crowded, setting of a family dwelling, not a lonely barn far outside the city gates.
A very different picture.
However, the very earliest non-biblical tradition places the birth elsewhere entirely, in a cave.
Yes. As early as AD 150, Justin Martyr, a significant early Christian apologist, recorded the tradition that the birth occurred in a specific cave just outside Bethlehem. This tradition was so strong that when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, he built the magnificent Church of the Nativity directly over this site in 330 AD.
And it remains one of the world's oldest continuously operating churches.
It does, and the cave carries its own rich symbolism, especially in early Christian and Eastern art.
In early iconography, the cave is essential.
It symbolizes Christ's descent into the very depth of the human condition and the world's darkness, from which the light of Christ then emerges. It's a profound theological statement that the Messiah must enter the lowest, most humble, and darkest place. The 2nd century proto-gospel of James reinforces this cave setting as well.
Okay, let's move on to the perennial mystery of the ox and the donkey. They are indispensable in every nativity scene, yet they are nowhere in Matthew or Luke. Why are they always included?
These animals have been constant companions in nativity depictions since at least the 4th century, and they serve an intense symbolic purpose. They act as a visual sermon.
A visual sermon, I like that.
Their inclusion is widely believed to refer to the Old Testament prophecy found in Isaiah chapter 1, which states, "The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's manger. Israel has no knowledge, my people have no understanding."
That is incredibly specific. So they function as a visual reference to a theological critique.
Exactly. They represent the created, non-rational order, recognizing its creator by recognizing the manger, contrasting sharply with humanity, specifically Israel, who lacked understanding of God's arrival.
They're visual cues for theological comparison.
That's right. And furthermore, the inclusion of all the animals, the sheep, sometimes even a dog symbolizing vigilance, it underscores the idea that the Nativity encompasses the whole of God's creation, human and animal, bowing before the divine.
We also see the use of ruined classical architecture in Renaissance art. What did those crumbling pillars signify?
In Renaissance and Baroque art, artists often deliberately placed ruined Roman architecture in the background of nativity scenes to symbolize the fall of the old pagan culture and the simultaneous emergence of Christianity.
So the birth of the new king represents the birth of a new world order within the crumbling structure of the old pagan empire.
A powerful visual metaphor.
And finally, there was a major deliberate shift in how Jesus was depicted in the nativity scene starting in the 13th century, led largely by the Franciscans.
A huge shift. Prior to that era, the artistic image of Jesus was often distant, formal, and authoritative, that of the Lord and Master. The 13th century saw a profound shift, largely driven by Franciscan piety, which focused intensely on the humanity and humility of Christ.
St. Francis himself is credited with creating the first nativity crèche.
He is. And this movement emphasized Jesus' humility and the tender joys of the nativity, which were seen as the counterpoint to the agony of the crucifixion. This shifted the artistic focus to a more compassionate, tender, and approachable image of Jesus, which transformed popular Christian devotion across the world.
So if we look back across all of our sources, we're left with a story that is far richer and more complex than the sentimental version we inherited.
Much more so. We now know that the Magi were not just 3 anonymous travelers, they were powerful kingmakers of the Parthian Empire, whose arrival was a dramatic, destabilizing political statement that forced Herod's hand.
And the gospel accounts were intentionally selective. Matthew argued for Jesus as the Jewish fulfillment, Luke presented him as the universal savior, and their narratives of the birth are fundamentally independent, serving distinct theological goals.
And the date we universally celebrate, December 25th, is the result of a two-pronged, multi-century approach. An ancient theological calculation that rooted conception on the date of death. Overlaid with massive cultural context, specifically the Roman solstice and Saturnalia festivals. Even if the historical evidence strongly suggests the actual birth likely happened in the warmer fall months, the date we have is firmly rooted in the spiritual needs and cultural strategies of the early church.
We've gained this knowledge of multiple perspectives, profoundly enriching our understanding of the stories we thought we knew.
We're left with a narrative that has been continuously shaped by theology, politics, and culture over 2 millennia, transforming a historical event into an enduring mythos.
And that profound understanding of tradition versus truth brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider, which challenges the modern celebration itself, drawing on a historical debate that existed in the early church.
We look to the 3rd century writer Origen, who insisted that of all the holy people in the scriptures, no one is recorded to have kept a feast or held a great banquet on his birthday.
He goes on to say,
"It is only sinners, like Pharaoh and Herod, both of whom executed people during their birthday celebrations, who make great rejoicings over the day on which they were born into this world below." This is a powerful early critique of celebration itself.
This historical debate forces us to look at the nature of the celebration. The Magi gave gifts unto Jesus, not to each other.
That's a critical distinction.
When we consider the massive global resources spent on modern holiday gift-giving, sometimes reaching almost $500 billion just in American holiday shopping alone, an amount that could address countless humanitarian crises, the knowledge we've gained presents a profound choice.
The point of the Nativity, as revealed in the sources, is the birth of the new man who commands radical humility and charity. If the focus shifts from a cycle of reciprocal gift exchange among the wealthy to a redirection of those resources towards the needy, the homeless, the sick, the hungry as commanded concerning his brethren, then the historical knowledge becomes applicable wisdom.
The question is, do we prioritize the tradition of reciprocal giving and revelry, or do we prioritize the radical humility and charity commanded by the King whose arrival we are celebrating? That is the final thought to mull over as you reflect on this deeper dive.
The Bible isn't just a history book. It's a living, challenging text. As you reflect on what we covered today regarding this topic, consider how this new context changes your reading of the verses. If you appreciated this breakdown, sharing it with just one friend who struggles with understanding the Bible is the best way you can support the channel. Subscribe for more, click here for your next explanation, and never stop seeking clarity. Until next time.